Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our ninth week of lectures in leadership and organizational behavior. As has been customary in the last weeks, we will be picking up where we left off during the last lecture. So basically, we will be trying to finish up with the communication and coaching prior to continuing with the scheduled lecture for today, that is negotiation techniques, which is something that we have already covered in other lectures. But again, we have to look at it from the perspective of the organizational behavior theory. So last time when we talked about communication, we basically were discussing about the interpersonal communication methods, and basically we said then when we ought to list what are the most prominent or the most important communication modes, then we said that oral communication along with written communication, as well as nonverbal communication that we will be come up to in just a little bit, are probably the most important ones that convey the meaning at a various level of interpersonal understanding. So each of them has their own advantages and disadvantages. We went through the oral one last time. Then we started discussing about the written communication, and we took up the discussion by looking at the electronic communications as well. So basically, we checked the email and or what are the advantages and the disadvantages of using the email as a written communication form. So after email, we pick up or we continue with the electronic communications again, which is still a more useful way of writing nowadays. So basically, we understand that technology has taken us forward when it comes to the written forms of communication, and the digital communication or digital writing communication is something that is pretty much prevalent nowadays. So another form of electronic communication would be instant messaging as well as text messaging. So something that probably we tend to use a lot more in our day-to-day basics. So basically we have instant messaging, the likes of, for example, Google Talk that we can use from our Gmail accounts. Then we have the Facebook Messenger. We have other forms of instant messaging, such as the case with, for example, Viber or WhatsApp or other programs. Then we have also those that are proprietary to specific companies, such as the Blackberries or the iPhones. And obviously, we also have the text messaging, either through an SMS or an MMS, something that still uses some forms of portable communication. So most of these forms are actually based on using mobile devices, be that tablets or be that smartphones nowadays, or even other forms of telephones or mobile phones that we tend to have on us during all time. Again, both of them, be that instant or text messaging, they are both types of real-time communication. And their main usage is basically based on the fast and inexpensive format of communication. That's why it is very, very much used in the business world nowadays. But as much as it is a very fast and inexpensive way of communication, especially when it comes to routine tasks, it can also be intrusive and distracting as well. Because nowadays we understand that a phone is probably part of everybody's life, even when we are on a break, even when we are out for a drink, a telephone is on the desk or on the table, and we are constantly checking or communicating using these types of instant or text messaging, which is very bad when it comes to building relationships, especially or other networks. It's because we tend to focus on various parts of the conversation at the same time. So even though it is very inexpensive, it's fast, it's instantaneous basically. Nowadays, even with the advent of mobile data packages or worldwide, it is very cheap and easy to use internet in our smart devices. So the growth of instant messaging, for example, or text messaging basically has been just spectacular. We ought to think that, for example, in 2001, only 8% of US employees were using it. And now, a decade and a half later, basically the number is more than 50% of people. Again, because it is very inexpensive and it is very, so to say, impersonal or in a nature, because we tend to blur the line between private life as well as work life in itself. So when we're talking about the instant messaging basically means that there's an immediate, not e-message, so to say, not email, that is sent to receiver's desktop or device, whereas text messages are usually short messages of roughly 160 characters, similar to a tweet probably, that are typically sent to cell phones or other handheld devices. So but even though they are very important and they are used a lot nowadays, they cannot replace just good old email. Email is still probably a better device for when we're trying to convey longer messages that must be saved for official purposes or probably for simple rehearsal in the future. Instant messaging in general or text messaging are preferable for 1 to 2 line messages that would just simply clutter up email inbox if we tend to send a lot of them. So for example, are you there yet? Or when will you be coming to the meeting is probably a short message that can be conveyed through an instant or text messaging. Whereas if you want to send an agenda, for example, for the meeting, we will still be using email. So email is still for larger information packages that needs a lot of reading or as well as storing for further use, whereas SMS and instant messaging are more related to, let's say, shorter command communication types of communication in general, or that is as much as it relates to. Then we also have something else that has come with the development of technology, internet, especially with the Web 2.0. That is the rise of the networking software. So basically, when we're using or when we're talking about networking software, we're still using the way that we are in fact linked in this social network systems that tend to spread throughout probably not just a nation, but also the world, and can be simply accessed by everybody that has some sort of a smart device, be that a computer, a laptop, or a smartphone, or some other types of smart devices such as iPad or other handheld tablets. And probably the best example of this widespread or viral widespread of said software packages probably would be Facebook. Now we also have, of course, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter, as well as other professional networks such as ZoomInfo, LinkedIn, ResearchGate, Academia, as well as some other corporate networks such as IBM, Blue Pages, for example. But again, when we're talking about them, Facebook is probably the one that leads the group with more than 2.2 billion users that have created accounts as of half or June 2018. Again, this is something that probably started as a, let's say, an experimental project within a university concept. So it was probably in the beginning, Facebook was meant only for college students of Ivy League in the United States, Ivy League of universities. But then because of its popularity and high demand, it became widespread to become the 2.2 billion user strong network that it is today. So basically we understand that it is by far one of the greatest method of being linked in the internet. Usually the individuals that are older than 25 are the ones that tend to populate these types of social networks, especially Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter. So basically the ones that probably don't have don't have that psychological background, but it is a more general use in general. So then we have, of course, LinkedIn, ResearchGate, Academia, ZoomInfo, those types of networks that tend to be better when it comes to creating more specific or niche groups of networking. Say when we're trying to create business groups or professional groups or employment groups, then we tend to use other forms of networking. And they generally, these types of groups do not tend to have those large margins of users. But again, the users that they have, for example, some 300 million, for example, users, that should be the number of LinkedIn accounts, are probably less than the Facebook. But again, when it comes to the relevance, those people that open a LinkedIn account basically have a more specific concept of social networking in mind. So that is a professional group as well. On the other hand, in a desire to maintain control over employee use of social networking for professional purposes, many organizations tend to develop their own in-house social networking applications. So basically, there are companies, and lots of them, that tend to create in groups when it comes to social networking. So basically, they can communicate with one another, and especially as it pertains to the organization themselves, they tend to create this place that is isolated from the outer world, when people can in fact communicate. And in this way, the company can control the gossip, the small talk, or even confidential information that might be distributed from one person to the other. So basically, it is something that is taking a hold. And many organizations, in fact, if they don't have a proprietary system, they can simply use those that are provided from big corporations such as Google, for example. So the problem is that no matter how private we might think that our private account is, it is still a public account. So basically, or all of our Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, or LinkedIn accounts are still out there for everybody to see. And the problem is that when anyone can see what we post, these types of posts that we tend to create, even though they might sometimes come as a result of some affect that we have, some emotional stance that we have discussed during our previous lectures, it is there to stay, even if we tend to delete that comment or that posting, for example. There is a system in the internet that once it goes there, it simply would remain there indefinitely. So basically, it is very critical when it comes for people that are tending or that are open for the job market or for some specific application procedure, for example, for countries that require visas, for example, for other countries, then usually they should bear in mind that even though these are private accounts, we're talking about public spaces, and they are usually used for screening of any type. So not only by the employer that tends to hire us, but also other institutional, be that government or non-government organization. So basically, the concept is that we ought to be very careful when it comes to the way that we use this networking software, because there have been cases such as a case with Cisco, for example, when one employee who got a job there basically claimed, or immediately after she got a job offer after the interview from Cisco, she tweeted that she now has to make a choice between, so basically a trade-off between getting a fatty paycheck on one hand, and working in a company and in a job environment that she really doesn't enjoy. So basically, she just wrote it to share her own opinion on Twitter, but unfortunately for her, one of Cisco employees, in fact, found out or read that tweet and basically red flagged it and sent it to the hiring committee, who basically immediately withdrew the offer, because that is bad publicity all around, and especially when it comes to the organizational behavior point of view, they would rather not hire somebody that does not want to be in the company. So in this case, social media might be a very important aspect of the screening process. So you have to take that into account as well. Another way that electronic communications, and again, we're talking about the written communication section, is when we use, for example, blogs. Blogs are specific website about a single person or a single character or a single activity that we tend to use. And they are typically updated daily. Usually, when we're talking about these types of blogs or web blogs generally, there are two types basically. One is that it tends to simply describe some certain aspect as a hobby or a leisure activity, but there are of course other blogs that tend to be sort of business-like activities. So basically now we have an electronic space and we can use that electronic market space even for selling ideas in a much easier or more receptive public or easily receptive public. But again, nowadays, it is estimated that there are more than 156 million blogs worldwide, and many of the US workers, in fact, have blogs. It is more popular in Western countries than it is in Eastern countries, basically because we tend, or let's put it this way, when it comes to the psychic distance or the cultural dimensions mentioned by the Hofstede, that we discussed earlier, then individualist cultures tend to, in fact, identify with with themselves. So they tend to create these types of single-person blogs, whether more, let's say, collectivist societies do not tend to try to differentiate themselves from the others. So a blog might be when it comes to the organizations, but individual blogs are much less prevalent uh, in the Orient or more collectivist societies, those that tend to have a more collectivist background in general. But of course, many organizations and organizational leaders tend to have blogs that also speak for the organizations. It is meant also to be some convenient and cheaper or less expensive, not cheap in general, but less expensive a way of getting some promotion or publicity for the organization. So again, it is a very popular but also potentially dangerous activity because employees might post harmful information because it is their own blog, and again it is not under the control of the organization. An employee, when they are discussing their day-to-day activities in their blogs, they might post harmful information about the company. Again, this is both ways, it goes both ways because such comments in fact may be cause for dismissal, such as was the case when we mentioned about the person or the lady that got a job offer at Cisco. So it's not only the social media, but also blogs that might be used as a case for dismissal. So basically, there is no protection of human rights or the right to speech, basically, because the First Amendment of rights includes, in the US Constitution, includes these types of basic human rights when it comes to living as well as right to speak or to say what they think. So basically, these rights are not rigidly protected when it comes to using these types of electronic communication, because in a way they tend to contradict what the company and what, for example, might be not only written but also some sort of psychological contract between the employee as well as the employer or the company themselves. But it can also be against company policy to post in a blog during company time and on company equipment or connection. So basically, it should be noted that when we're talking about a private blog, then it should not be during the work time of the company or using, for example, property or equipment that are owned by the company. For example, if I'm delivering this lecture using PCB property, basically, if I'm doing a personal blog, I would not be entitled to use the company resources for personal usage of blogs. except if the blog is something owned by the or owned and controlled by the organization, in which they can monitor the quality of the blogs when it comes to common interests of the organization. So putting it this way, we tend to understand that blogs are a double-edged sword. So because they can be used by the organizations to increase their awareness and as well as positive publicity, they can also be used by employees to push for sometimes hurtful or negative information altogether. So basically, trying to control the private blogs is something that might not fall within the strict jurisdiction of the organizations, but because employees, in fact, and if the employees are talking about the organizations, it tend to fall within the interest scope of the organization to control bad publicity or eventual bad publicity that otherwise should have been solved by direct communication between an employee that is dissatisfied with a certain element within the company and their superior or the HR manager altogether. So in this sense, we also have Twitter, which is a sort of hybrid social networking service that also allows people to post micro blogs to their subscribers about any topic, including work. So basically, we mention Twitter here as being some sort of networking software because it is as such, but also people as well as organizations tend to use it as also a micro blog. So basically, they tend to keep people updated on what is going on or to give some thoughts about specific events that are related to the organization or that individual. And usually these type of people, especially those that are successful when it comes to Twitter, such as, for example, certain influencers, such as Richard Branson of the Virgin Corporation, they tend to use these types of, or the Twitter accounts for giving or spreading information as well as personal thoughts altogether. Then we also have something else when it comes to communication, and that is when we're talking about video conferencing. And video conferences is not a written form of communication. It's basically a verbal form of communication as well. So basically, this falls under the verbal forms of communication, but it is digital in nature. That's why we tended to discuss it in this order. So video conferences tend to use live audio and video using internet streaming in order to create a virtual meeting. So now it uses more inexpensive webcams, such as the one that we're using to deliver this lecture, which is a webcam embedded in a laptop, for example, as well as laptops in place of formal video conferencing rooms that used to be the case previously when the technology was not developed at this scale. So basically, teleconferencing nowadays is the microphone back on? Good. Yeah, I saw the flickering light in the microphone. So yeah, as we were talking about the video conferencing, basically we're talking about using technology on the way that we can deliver inexpensive methods of using the technology in place when it comes to communicating information. So basically, video conferencing is better when we're trying to create these types of longer sessions or also meetings with people around the world. And then we're still using it by using internet connectivity. So basically, obviously, that is something that is to be developed further on. And most of the modern organizations tend to use video conferencing or some other forms of teleconferencing as well in order to communicate with one another. And companies such as Skype, for example, Viber, and the like tend to use these types of or to create the ability for firms to understand. This GoToMeeting platform, for example, is just as well when we're trying to create these types of video conferencing as well, or even live streaming, such as the case, for example, with YouTube as well. So basically, you can simply live stream to YouTube, and everybody or select audience can follow you live. So that is when we're talking about the functioning of both oral as well as written communication. But on the other hand, another very important way of communicating with people is when we're trying to use also non-verbal communications. And probably this is the time to understand the saying that sometimes silence is a very strong message altogether. So it's not only silence, basically, but when we're trying to deliver a verbal message, we also tend to impart some unspoken message. And sometimes the nonverbal component may stand alone altogether, basically. So that's why we say it's that sometimes silence is golden. So when we're talking about nonverbal communication, we're talking about the way that we try to convey or to, in fact, follow the verbal or the written communication by including, for example, body movements or the intonations or the emphasis that we give to certain words so that we understand what is important or not. Also, we might create facial expressions of being excited, angry, happy in order for the information to be understood, as also the physical distance between the sender and receiver is very important. We will be discussing about each of these in turn. But basically, most of the time when we're trying to send a message and we use a monotone messaging format, we tend to miss the point. So basically, this nonverbal communication is something that tends to better help to understand the information. And basically, when one of the students, in fact, asked whether we can use the webcams more often when we're delivering messages, it's basically spot on to what we are discussing right now. It is much easier to understand a message if you are in fact witnessing the nonverbal communication of the speaker, because in that sense you tend to understand the intonation, the facial expressions, as well as other bodily movements that might impart some certain message when it comes to a specific message that we want to deliver. So obviously, the voice is gone again. All right, so we tend to have a little difficulties, but let's get on. So when we're talking about the advantages, we tend to think that it tends to support other communications as well as provide observable expression of emotion and feeling, but also we understand that there are certain cultures that tend to interpret certain nonverbal communication cues differently. So if we tend to mispercept these types of body language or gestures, that it can influence the receiver's interpretation of the message. There are obviously some general, some universal, let's call body movements that tend to tell us how we feel when we speak. For example, if we are crossing our hands all together when we're talking with somebody face to face, no matter how open we tend to express ourselves, that is a defensive position. So basically, we are trying to create a distance or withhold information, or we simply do not feel comfortable to discuss something with our partner. So basically, then there is obviously the nodding, which in some cultures it might represent a positive or an affirmative action. So it's a yes, and there are certain cultures when nodding might in fact impart some other or negative meaning. Then we have also the okay, for example, nonverbal cue, which is a very good, for example, a nonverbal information in some countries, but obviously when it comes to other countries, that is a very offensive gesture to make. Especially, I think it is in Central Asian countries in the southern part, in India and those regions. Also, again, for example, we have this great. So basically, it's something that is great, or it is something that we use for food in certain countries in India. But again, this is probably the signature Italian gesture when they are trying to ask a question as what is going on, or why, or it's basically a general query gesture. They don't even have to speak. If you're in Italy and you do this gesture, it basically means that there is some sort of query or something that you don't understand, or you don't feel that it is correct. So again, it is some sort of misperception of body languages that sometimes might impart the meaning between cultures. The list goes on and on. We can never get enough. So again, let's talk about each of them in turn. When we're talking about the body movement, basically, we're talking about some sort of unconscious motions that tend to provide meaning. So basically, as we said, if we tend to cross the hand, it creates a distance. When we're speaking towards somebody that we enjoy talking or we simply like, we tend to lean forward to that person. So basically, there are unconscious motions that tend to provide a certain meaning. Then also it shows extent of interest in another, as well as relative perceived status differences. So basically, the way that we perceive people that are in a lower standing that or stature that we are. When it comes to intonation, for example, and voice emphasis, we will see, for example, how the same sentence might convey very different meanings when it comes to the way that we emphasize one single word within a sentence. And most of the languages can have this issue. So basically, it comes to the intonation as well as the emphasis of voice in certain words. Also, we have facial expressions. Obviously, facial expressions is one that is the most easily understood, because in most cases, facial expressions is something that is universal human trait. So basically, if you're happy, you are happy, and if you're angry or you're sad, it shows in the face, and it is generally understood well by the people. There are some moods that are if you might recall from previous lectures, there are some moods that are expressed very similarly. So basically, we have to take note of other nonverbal cues to understand what do these facial expressions in fact show. And then we have also the physical distance between sender and receiver, which in fact is something that is also very cultural bound. There are cultures that tend to create this idea that closer to one another is not only a sign of affection, but also trust. So basically, people tend to hug each other. But there are also other cultures when, in fact, getting too close might be considered problematic and invasion of the private bubble. And we will come to that in just a bit. So again, when we're talking about body language, we're, as we said, usually more inclined to position ourselves closer to people we like, and we tend to touch them more often. So that is not only in private social life, but also within a business environment. So basically, we tend to stay more often as well as closer to people we like, even if we're talking about meetings, even when we're talking about formal or non-formal gatherings, having a break, or any other form. So basically, we should agree, or we could agree, that every body movement has its meaning, and no movement in fact is accidental, even though most of them tend to be unconscious. So we tend to act our state of being by using this nonverbal body language, and unless we are very strictly trained, the body language or interpersonal or non-verbal communication, in fact, might betray the way that what we want to project. They usually tend to display our inner feeling. So basically the concept of poker face, for example, is something that tends to create some sort of the idea that we can in fact express ourselves differently to the way that we feel inside. And the two most important messages that body language tends to convey are the extent to which we like another and are interested in another's views, as well as the perceived status that exists between a sender as well as a receiver. For example, when we smile, we tend to project trustworthiness towards others, or if we tend to uncross our arms, on the other hand, we tend to appear approachable, or if we stand when others are sitting, we are trying to signal some sort of authority to that person. Also, we're more likely to position ourselves closer, as we said, to people that we tend to like, as well as we would touch them more often. So similarly, if we feel that we are of a higher status than another, and this does not only mean social status, this might also mean, for example, a status when it comes to the position that one hold, or the knowledge that one have, or any other judgment that makes a person feel superior to the others. We are more likely to display body movements such as crossed legs, for example, or a slouched seated position that reflect a casual as well as a relaxed manner, for example. So studies, in fact, and research tend to indicate that people read much more about another's attitude and emotions from their nonverbal cues than what they're in fact saying. So basically, their nonverbal cues are much more important to understand what a person is or how a person feels rather than what a person is speaking, in fact. If nonverbal cues tend to conflict, in fact, with the speaker's verbal message, the cues are sometimes more likely to be believed by the listener rather than the message itself. So a body position or movement can communicate something of the emotion behind the message, but also when it is linked with spoken language, it gives a fuller meaning to a sender's message. If you read, for example, the minutes of meetings, a verbatim format, you wouldn't grasp the impact of what was said the same way as if you, for example, were in the meeting. Because reading the minutes of meeting, you basically understand what is the result of what has been discussed. But if you were there or on a meeting, or if you have watched the meeting, or in this case, a lecture, by using this video, then you tend to miss what are the key points of the discussions and what are the important segments of the lecture that the lecturer or the meeting members tend to convey when they are doing these meeting or lecturing sessions. Because when it comes to nonverbal communication, there is no record for it, unless, of course, when we use technology and we record these types of meetings, and that is different. But if we're talking about one-on-one communication, then that is a time and place to understand what has been said rather than later if we read the same message again. So when we're talking about the intonation as well as the context, we're basically trying to understand how, for example, this sentence, why don't I take you to dinner tonight, might create different meanings based on where we will place the emphasis or how we change our tone as well as the meaning. So basically, let's put it this way. If we want to convey the meaning, I was going to take someone else, we tend to place the emphasis, for example, you. Why don't I take you to dinner tonight? So I was going to take someone else, but now I want to take you. So why don't I take you to dinner tonight instead of the guy you were going with? So basically, if we want to replace that guy that want to take you to dinner tonight, we would say, why don't I take you to dinner tonight instead of the guy you were going in? If we're trying to convey the meaning of I'm trying to find a reason why I shouldn't take you, we put the meaning in why. Why don't I take you to dinner tonight? So let's find a reason. Why am I not doing this already? Do you have a problem with me? Why don't I take you to dinner tonight? So we focus on don't. Why don't I take you to dinner tonight? Do you have a problem with me? then instead of going on your own, why don't I take you to dinner tonight? So basically, now we are again putting the emphasis into both don't I. Why don't I take you to dinner tonight, for example? And we focus on the tonight section. We tend to address that we want to take her tonight instead of tomorrow. So why don't I take you to dinner tonight instead of tomorrow? So why don't I take you to dinner tonight again, not tomorrow night, but tonight again. It is something that is related to tonight and to why. So if we take this why don't I take you to dinner tonight, that means that we're asking specifically for today and not another day. So basically, I'm not a great actor when it comes to probably stressing these differences, but the concept is that if we tend to convey a different meaning by using the same sentence, we usually tend to place specific tones into different wording within the same message. But facial expressions also tend to convey a meaning. Facial expressions, along with intonations, can show arrogance, as we said, aggressiveness, fear, shyness, and other characteristics, which can furthermore complicate what we understand by this meaning that we have here. Because sometimes we can, for example, ask this question, and now we're going more on the social aspect of asking somebody out for dinner, probably in a date, for example. So if we do this with an aggression or tend of a arrogance, we tend to tell that we are better than the person that you are trying to take. So it is some sort of competition. Why don't I take you to dinner tonight? Whereas if you're shy, then you are questioning whether you are at the same stature of level to the person that you're talking or the person that is taking her. Why don't I take you to dinner tonight? So basically, it's something that is related to how we say things, but also the facial expressions as well. And we can go on with this all day long, probably. So when it comes to the physical distance, for example, physical distance is another issue altogether, because physical distance might also have its meaning. And obviously, when we're trying about it, we're talking about this bus stop right here. And probably with my fellow colleagues that are of let's say European or Eastern European and Southern European and most of the collectivist countries, this might not be some issue. But if we tend to import or to put, for example, some sort of a Nordic person in this type of organization, they might feel very much uncomfortable. If you tend to look at how, for example, a bus stop might look, for example, in Norway or in Sweden, this is a nightmare for those people. There might be 5 people that are spread right in this amount of space. So we would have one person here, we would have one person here, and then we would have somebody here, and the last one would be here, and there would be a huge amount of space between people. Even if they don't know each other, they will not be talking to each other, and most of them would be wearing headphones. So basically, they tend to shun out any type of communication in public spaces, because these types of cultures, the Nordic cultures especially, and also some other types of individualistic societies, tend to feel that private space, or this private bubble as it is called, so basically this is some sort of private bubble, is something that is very important. So each person has their own personal bubble, and it is something that should not be violated, no matter the space. And that is some issue, especially when it comes to using public spaces such as a bus stop, a bus, or a metro station altogether. But especially when it comes to for example, uh, business environments, and again, as we said, some European countries feel intimate in business. So a business-like distance in some European countries feels intimate in many parts of North America. For example, Southern European people, even in business spaces, tend to be much more direct. They tend to stand closer or even touch one another a lot, whereas people in northern parts of the Europe and also probably across the Atlantic, tend to create this idea of, as we said, of a personal bubble. So basically, um, uh, if we tend to stand closer to somebody that than rather than that country or that culture tends to deem as appropriate, it might indicate that there is an expression of aggressiveness or even sexual interest. So it might raise a red flag for sexual harassment within the organization, even though that is not the message that the sender wants to convey with that body movement. So, for example, if a Balkan person in an Italian, or let's even include here a Spanish, might tend to stand closer to somebody in a workplace in a Swedish company, for example, that might be in fact interpreted as that person being aggressive because he's standing close to somebody else, or even with a sexual interest. But when it comes to the way that the sender is viewing that message, is he's just being interested, or he's trying to be closer or more trusty towards that person. But on the other hand, if the opposite comes true, so basically there are some people from these individualist countries that come to Southern Europe, part of as we took an example, then if we stay further away when we could be closer, then it might signal disinterest or displeasure with what is being said. So basically, these types of conflicts might create simply by either standing close together or standing far apart in both social environment as well as professional or business environment altogether. So this is something that is very important and interesting to notice. And there comes the importance of your other course that you're doing, that is international business, when you tend to understand these types of differences between cultures and the way that you tend to adapt yourself to various to various business environments all over the world. Great. So the concept is that after we get to understand all the types or the modes of communication, then we tend to lean towards creating something that is also known as knowledge management. Knowledge management basically is the process of organizing and distributing an organization's collective wisdom so the right information gets to the right people at the right time. So basically, organizations can in fact use all the modes of communication, especially the digital types that we discussed, so that they can create information that is easily accessible and approachable by people at the right time. And most of the management information systems that are in place, tend to provide these types of knowledge management. So there are huge databases that can be accessed by people, of course, in relation to their clearance level to the information. Basically, obviously, we understand that critical or strategic data are not accessible to low-tier employees or operational managers, obviously. So why is this knowledge management important? It is usually important because intellectual assets are just as critical as physical assets altogether. So basically, we tend to have some sort of inventory in which we tend to collect not only physical assets that are invaluable for everyday operation, as we have discussed many times over, but also when it comes to intellectual assets, we should have some sort of collection point when people can understand, can take over where somebody left off in thinking process, decision making, or generating information, but also somewhere where people can initiate new ideas, concepts, and thought processes. And especially this is important that because when individuals tend to leave, there are some sort of time when people tend to leave the organization, then their knowledge as well as experience tends to go with them. And because especially intellectual assets are closely related to the people that tend to have them, usually when a person leaves, that creates some issues or a gap when it comes to the routines of the organizations up to that point. Because that individual, along with experience and knowledge, was simply a cog in the machine or the process of activities of an organization. So basically, when that person leaves, the organization might still function, but it will be missing potentially critical knowledge or experience from that person. So a knowledge management, in fact, would reduce the redundancy that might be created if we tend to use multiple people or multiple systems at the same time for the same for various issues, as well as can make the organization more efficient by noting these types of experiences and knowledges in some sort of a software or some sort of probably also in unwritten culture of the organization itself, but it still requires an organization culture that values sharing of information. So again, we're talking about trying to ease in or to even out the competitive nature of the organization. Again, we're trying to create organizations that are more built around teamwork and common purposes or values rather than individual or personal promotion or some sort of strict reward system that pushes people to be individualistic and to seek their own interest in line with getting rewards. So basically, we're looking more of team players or let's say team organizations rather than individualistic organization in order for us to build this knowledge management. In those cases, people might tend to be more liable and free to share information as they go, as they learn. Then we have, when we talk about communication, we need to understand how we come about to choose the communication channel. And basically, one of the best way to choose a communication channel is by understanding the richness of the channel itself. So basically, channels of communications tend to vary in their capacity to convey information. The richer that channel is, the more information it can convey. So basically, they tend to handle multiple cues simultaneously. They tend to facilitate a rapid feedback and also be very personal. So basically, as we will see, well, before we go on, we should understand that right now what we're doing is basically this run, right? So we're doing a live speech. A live speech is considered to be one of the higher, let's put it like here-ish, that is the midpoint. So basically, live speech is on the richer segment of the communication channel. That means that it can handle multiple cues simultaneously. Basically, you can listen to my non-verbal cues. So basically, the speaking part, my intonation, or my emotion outburst when it comes to facial expressions, and also the information that is distributed, in this case, by video conference assisted technology, that is by sharing the slides. So basically, we are doing something that is somewhere in between the live speech and a video conference, because we are doing a live speech, obviously, but we're also using notes like the ones that we're using, the PowerPoint, that are more similar to video conference meetings. So basically, it is a higher, it is a richer channel altogether, because we can use all these cues that we said. It tends to facilitate rapid feedback, which we can use when people tend to respond to by using the chat, for example, or even voice altogether, to ask questions, to make remarks, or even, such as the case previously, to help me if there are some technical difficulties that might impart or make it challenging for the meaning to be conveyed. And also, it is also very personal, because when we tend to have this type of meetings or these types of lectures, we are in fact engaged in a very individual or personal communication that people can share thoughts as well as feedback live, so to say. So as you can see, apart from our example, from all this figure that is here that we have, we tend to understand that probably the most or the richest form of communication channel is probably the face-to-face conversation. And that is why we tend to call this lecture not only organizational behavior, but also leadership and organizational behavior, because we tend to think that communication is probably the most influential way in which we can not only convey a meaning, but also to tend to make things work within an organization. And because face-to-face conversations tend to be the most or the richest as well as the most important channels of communication, people that tend to have more leadership attributes tend to be able to use face-to-face conversation much easier as well as much more efficiently than those that tend to have less leadership traits or characteristics, even though we claim that there are no strict traits or characteristics of leaders. But again, we said that when it comes to openness to new experience, to being outgoing and everything, that is what we are trying to mean. But when we're saying about these types of leadership traits that we are inclined to talk about. So why it is richer? Because it tends to transmit the most information per communication episode using multiple information cues such as words, postures, facial expressions, gestures, intonations, immediate feedback that can be done as we are doing right now, for example, both verbal as well as nonverbal. So basically the feedback can be if you ask a question if you don't understand, or it can be nonverbal if you simply just minimize the window and keep on doing what you're doing, because the lecture might not be either understood, interesting, or coherent enough for your understanding, basically. So it might happen as that. So it is some sort of nonverbal feedback that I might get, for example, if each of you that are listening to this live stream might have a camera as well, for example, as well as simply the personal touch of being present. Others are lean in that they score low on these factors. For example, we have the impersonal written media such as formal reports as well as bulletins. As you can see, they are very low on channel richness, and we understand probably why, because they tend to convey a meaning in a verbatim form, as we said earlier. So basically, if we're sending a memorandum or a memo or some sort of bulletin or even a formal report, we are simply stating facts, decisions, or information in a very straightforward pattern. So basically, we are not conveying any emotions or some sort of nonverbal meaning to them. So a person simply might understand in accordance to their internal filters that are obviously related to their judgment as well as bounded rationality. So the information that they have in disposal. So when we're trying to use these types of memos, letters, or these types of, let's say, more impersonal forms of communication, as we have here. So basically, this is the way that we go from poorer to richer communication. And if we're choosing these types of more impersonal or less richer or poorer, let's put it that way, communication channels, then basically we need to understand what type of message are we trying to convey. So whether the message is routine or, for example, non-routine. Routine messages are usually those that tend to be very straightforward and have a minimum of ambiguity. Routine messages can also effectively be communicated through channels that are lower in richness. For example, when we have some formal report. So basically the report is what it is. Or when we're trying, for example, to create a newscast for our employees. So what has happened during these days? News is news. So basically we tend to just simply state it over through some sort of a bulletin that is spread through email or classically through some other form of written or classical written form. On the other hand, if we are dealing with non-routine messages, then they tend to be usually complicated and have the potential for misunderstanding because they are unique in nature, and people are in fact unexperienced or unknowing of the message that is being presented to them. then they have this potential for misunderstanding. Non-routine messages then can be only effectively be communicated by selecting these types of forms, such as face-to-face conversations or video conferences, live speeches, telephone conversations. So basically, all the types that are that are very rich when it comes to channel of communication. So again, we need to understand that all of them are in fact important, no matter how rich or poor a channel is. But again, we have to understand what type of message we are imparting. So we're giving an information, for example, to students as to when an exam will take place or when or how the syllabus will be laid out. We can simply, for example, try to write an email to give the information of when the exam is going to happen or what are the formal requirements of a course, for example. But since communication and coaching lecture is something that is more non-routine, it is something that is more unique in nature, for example, we tend to use more richer channels, such as, in this case, something in between live speech and video conferencing, so that we can convey the meaning and make sure that we are using the feedback as well that is coming in constantly by the students in form of questions as well as requirements for further information, so that we can in fact create these types of a two-way communication that will be beneficial to the receiver of the information, in this case you as students. Great. So what are the barriers to effective communication? Before going on to the barriers to effective communication, so basically now we will be continuing with barriers to effective communication. So far we have discussed why we choose certain channels, and then we discussed what are the best channels for certain situations, and now we will see whether there are some barriers that might hinder us to create effective communication between people. So basically, when we're talking about filtering, for example, filtering means that the sender's manipulation of information so that it will be seen more favorably by the receiver. So by filtering, basically is when a manager who tells, for example, his boss, another manager, what he feels that the boss wants to hear is when we basically filter information. And that happens probably more often than it should when an employee tells what they want to, what they think that their superior wants to hear, in fact. So the more that an organization has a vertical level of hierarchy, the more there are opportunities for filtering. But some filtering will occur wherever there are status differences. So basically, the higher that there is a difference or the gap between the status, the more these types of filtering of information will be prevalent during communication. Factors such as, for example, a fear of conveying bad news, as well as a desire to please the boss, might often lead to employees to tell their superiors what they think that their boss wants to hear, thus distorting upward communication. Obviously, this tends to have a spiraling effect. So basically, if there is a bad news and the employee tends to distort or filter or tend to smoothen the information, and if this vertical communication is strict within that organization, and even the supervisor, when they tell to the manager, they tend to filter the information further on. So basically, what the real situation is down at the real life might come as a different information all the way up the chain of command to the top management. Then we also have selective perception. When we're talking about selective perception, basically we're talking about how people tend to selectively interpret what they see on the basis of their interests, background, experience, as well as attitude. So basically, we have discussed that every person has some sort of bounded rationality because they don't have all the information to process all the incoming communication that they have. So basically, sometimes they simply tend to perceive that what is being discussed is something that is related to how they perceive or how they have their own interest, backgrounds, experience, as well as attitudes towards certain things. For example, if I am to speak to you about the coming of winter, then depending where you are or how winter is perceived by that culture or you as an individual, it might be something that we ought to understand. So basically, if you like skiing, you might perceive the information that I'm talking about the winter as positive, but on the other hand, if you are more thinking about the increase in the utility bill, for example, because of the heating issue, then you might be perceiving the communication regarding winter in a more worrisome or negative uh, aspect. So the selective perception means that the receivers tend to project their interest as well as expectation into the communication as they are trying to decode them. Another more specific example or more professional example, let's put it this way, is when an employment interviewer who expects, for example, a female job applicant to put her family ahead of her career is likely to see that characteristic in all female applicants, regardless of whether any of the women actually feel that way. So basically, if we have a certain employer who tends to think that all female employees tend to put family before the job, so they are not careeristic in nature, they tend to put family before their career, they tend to think that way all the time, even with certain female employees that might or might not feel the same way about their career or family balance. So basically, this is something that is a selective perception, something that we see from our point of view, generally speaking. Another issue that might create a barrier to effective communication might be information overload. And this is again something that we have discussed when we talked about decision making during our decision making lecture. So basically, we said that at no certain point we can get all the information to make a decision, because people tend to have a lot of information in disposal, but on the other hand, not all the information to make a perfect decision. We said that people tend to be sometimes overloaded with information. That is usually the condition, for example, in which information inflow tends to exceed the capacity of the individual to process that information. So when people are faced with information overload, they usually tend to either select, so make this selectives of the information based on their bounded rationality, that is the concept, or they might simply tend to simply ignore the information, pass over to somebody else, or simply forget about it altogether. IT, for example, when we're talking IT, we're talking about all the communication or the digital communication channels that we use nowadays tend to cause work-life conflicts, since people nowadays can never be offline. And employees must tend to balance the need for constant communication with their personal needs. So basically, they need to balance the needs that they have for constant communication with their personal needs, to have some sort of not only physical but also mental break from their work, or they can risk burnout from being on the call for 24 hours a day every day of the week. So basically, the use of instant messaging, also when we're using text messaging, emails, and we have them in use every day by using our mobile phones or computers, then we are in fact risking not only to be affected by information overload, in which we just simply skip or scan through the emails until we find the one that is probably more interesting to us, and simply skip the rest, or by simply be exposed to burnout. So basically, burnout means when we are so overexposed that we tend to basically become a less and less interested, or less and less able to be effective in the work because of our higher level of stress, or higher level of being constantly within the parameters of the work altogether. Also, emotions tend to be a barrier to effective communication. When we're talking about how emotions can be a barrier to effective communication, this is sometimes it is important to mention because we previously said that emotions, on the other hand, are a very important part of the nonverbal communication channel or mode, because we said that if we don't, for example, see other person speaking or hear somebody talking, then we might miss on a lot of emotional cues that might give us background to what the message or what is the hidden message that is conveyed when a message is being transmitted. But on the other hand, how a receiver feels at the time of a message when the message is received will also influence how the message is interpreted. So basically, if you as listeners might be feeling down because it's probably a Monday and everybody would feel down on Mondays, or you might feel energetic because you have heard some other unrelated to the lecture, some positive news, then the way that your emotional status is right now might in fact influence how you interpret the message that we are sending through this stream. So one might interpret the same message differently, whether we're angry, distraught, or when we are happy. For example, individuals that have a positive mood are more confident about their opinions after reading, for example, some sort of persuasive message or some sort of usually an inspirational quotes that we find riddling the wall of Facebook nowadays. So well-designed arguments have a stronger impact on their opinion. But on the other hand, people that have a negative mood are more likely to scrutinize the message in great details, whereas those that are in positive moods tend to accept communication at face value. So they are more likely to simply accept the message without questioning it. Whereas people in negative mood tend to scrutinize the message to find out whether it is true or not. And this tends to relate to also the optimistic and pessimistic types of people according to their moods or certain personality traits that people tend to have. Other barriers to effective communication might include language, communication apprehension, gender differences, as well as lying. So when we're talking about a language, we're talking about how, for example, words can have a different meaning to different people, as we said earlier. But also, we tend to claim that age and context are, for example, the two biggest factors that we try to put into this influence to as a barrier to effective communication. For example, when business consultant Michael Schiller, that is something that you can find in the literature as well, when he asked his 15-year-old daughter where she was going with friends, he said that you need to recognize your RAs and measure against them. So basically, Schiller said that in response, his daughter simply looked at him like he was from outer space. And we know that from management perspectives, our ARA stands for accountability, responsibility, and authority. But obviously, a teenager wouldn't know about them. But a father would also be mystified in this case when faced with teen slang, especially with a modern meme society. So basically, there is a meme for everything. So there is a gender gap to the way that we understand, or even probably educational gap or professional gap between the way that we speak and the way that we are perceived. But also a strong message can be transmitted by simply remaining silent, as we said previously. Sometimes silence can be just as strong a message or even stronger that can communicate a non-interest or inability to deal with a certain topic. Silence can also be a simple outcome of information overload or a delaying period for considering a response. In either case, silence is a very important indicator of the communication, either as primary communication or even as a feedback to a communication in itself. So silence can in fact hurt the organizations a lot because employee silence can mean that managers lack the information about ongoing operational problems, and it can happen because employees, in fact, can feel apathetic about the organization, disengaged, or not involved in the process, or not important to the organization at all. So basically, this leaves the management in dark of what is going on at operational level. But on the other hand, if the management remains silent within an organization, this might leave the employees bewildered because in this case, there is lack of information on of how things are being done, what is happening in the decision-making processes, or what is expected of the employees in short, medium, or long-term period. And people tend to understand or identify themselves with the organization if the organizations tend to be more communication intensive, especially from the top-down uh, method. But on the other hand, when it comes to silence that are regarding discrimination, for example, harassment, corruption, and other forms of delinquence or misconduct, that means that top management cannot take action to eliminate problematic behavior. And this is some issue that probably tends to span outside the confinement of simply being effective or non-effective communication, because if people, especially employees, tend to be silent when it comes to perceived discrimination or actual discrimination being done to them or to others that they are observing, some sort of harassment or corruption, and there is no whistleblower in the midst of the employees, and that makes the organization susceptible to further delinquency acts as well as withdrawal from the employees. And this is something that might be catastrophic to the organization in the long term. So because the management cannot take action to eliminate a problem that they simply don't know exists altogether. Another barrier to effective communication might be communication apprehension. So when we're talking about communication apprehension, we're talking about for example, undue tension and anxiety that exist about oral communication, written communication, or both. So basically, we're talking about not only communication apprehensions, but it is something that we might further understand as a social anxiety. There are some certain people or certain traits that exist in people's personality that might find it more difficult or extremely difficult to talk with others face to face, or they become usually extremely anxious when they have to use a phone, when they have to reply to memorandums or emails, or even when a phone call would be, for example, faster. So they tend to resort, for example, to rely on more impersonal forms of communication, even though they know that if, for example, a simple phone call or simply walking to the manager or some other worker might do the job much more faster or much more accurately than simply writing an email. But there are email people, and then we have direct communication people. And that is what we talk about communication apprehension. So basically, there are people that are faced with these types of social anxiety. In fact, there are people that have phobias or even fears of speaking in public or speaking in front of other people, which is a very serious threat. So there are a lot of people that tend to think that public speaking to them is more frightening than, in fact, spiders or even snakes. And there are some people that even claimed that public speaking to them is something frightening to them, to something that is even to death itself. So basically, we have people that have these types of social anxiety or communication apprehension, and that in that cases we need to make sure that we know with what person are communicating in what way. So basically, if we are putting these types of shy or socially anxious people in a group when they are expected to share their opinions, such as a brainstorming, for example, session, we should understand that we are creating an unnecessary tension in these types of people when we can probably better use them if we use more convenient channels to them, even if they are in the lower end of the richness spectrum. And we also have, for example, another barrier to effective communication in the form of gender differences. And we have to make sure that we fully emphasize that when we're talking about gender differences, we're more talking about the perceived differences in the genders and their roles when it comes to professional landscape. So we're not talking about actual differences, because we have times and times over said that there are a little or even negligible differences between the personality traits of uh, different genders. It is more to the individual performance or preferences rather to the gender. But again, when we talk about the perceived gender differences, we're talking about the differences such as, for example, men tend to talk to emphasize status, whereas women usually tend to talk so that they can create connection or networking. So the difference is very small, it is fading, and might not be valid in many cultures or for the immediate future altogether. We have to make sure that uh, we give this intonation or emphasis to this gender differences. Then we have also probably the biggest barrier to effective communication, that is simply lying. Lying is a very straightforward, disruptive barrier to communication, because uh, lying is simply misstating the truth. But people tend to differ how they define what lying is. For example, and that is usually something that tends to be related to um, the cultural concept of the society, to the personal, societal, family, as well as educational concepts of ethics and ethical behavior, the morality, the level of, for example, religious affiliation, and etc. So basically, what is considered lying by some individuals might not be considered lying by some others. For example, if we deliberately withhold information about a mistake, is it a lie? Or simply you have to deny your role in the mistake so that you can be considered as lying. So basically, if you made some sort of mistake and you simply withhold information, you do not tell everybody, even if the manager is asking who has done it or who is responsible for it, and you know that you are responsible or who is responsible, but if you simply withhold information, is it lying? Or whether you have to simply say that no, it was not me, if you were the one responsible, so that you can be considered as lying. So again, this is a matter of wide debate and discussion between cultures, and fortunately for us, we can use our international law of students as a basis for such discussions as what is lying, for example, to you individually, to your culture and your background, both academic and cultural backgrounds altogether. But no matter the definition, people may tell 1 to 2 lies per day, with some individuals telling considerably more. So basically, now we're talking that everybody, in a sense, tend to lie, and probably the biggest lie, or so it has been found out, that people tend to make is when they ask, "How are you?" And many people, or generally everybody, will simply reply as fine, even if they are not fine and have some grave issues themselves, right? Because it is some sort of simply a formal or a ceremonial way of greeting one another. We simply tend to tell people that, okay, I'm fine. And that is one of the first lies that we tend to tell to every day. So evidence shows that people are more comfortable when they are lying over the phone than we're lying face to face to one another, and obviously they are more comfortable lying in emails than when they have to write something with pen and paper. Uh, and this probably tends to relate to the way that we interpret this morality of ourselves. So basically, if we are facing somebody and we're telling a lie, we are pushing our morality to the limit. And it is much easier if we do so over the phone, for example, because we tend to hide the unconscious facial expressions. Probably most of the people, when they lie, they have these types of uh, let's say these types of unique expressions that they make. They might, for example, blush. so become red in face, or their their eyes or the retina of the eyes might in fact dilute and expand, or they might simply made various body movements or eye movements or face movements that might indicate that they might be lying. So it is much easier to simply lie over the phone, because the only cue that the other person might be getting non-verbally is the intonation of the voice and not the other. So a person can simply control the voice but cannot control the voice and the facial expressions and other emotional outbursts that are related to for example, lying or stating something that is against your uh, morality principles. And also the same can be said about emails, for example, and writing, because when we're writing an email, we're simply jotting digital text, but when we're writing, we're doing it with our signature handwriting. So basically, our handwriting is part of our personality or distinctiveness, whereas when we're writing in a Times New Roman or Arial font, we're simply becoming less personal. So it is easier to simply write using an email than when we write with pen and paper. And usually it is hard to detect liars, since many nonverbal cues we tend to associate with lying can easily be associated with, for example, anxiety. So people that are anxious, socially anxious, that we said earlier while speaking, they tend to blush because they're shy when they speak to somebody else. They might tend to have those movements or bodily movements or emotional expressions similar to liars, even though they're not lying, they're simply socially anxious. And also, most people who lie take steps to guard against being detected. So they know that they're lying, so they tend to create these conscious guards so that people do not detect them. So they might look a person in the eye when lying, because they know that direct eye contact is so incorrectly assumed to be a sign of trustworthiness. So basically, people that lie are assumed to simply look everywhere else rather than the person. But when you're telling the truth, you tend to look somebody in the eye, or incorrectly perceived so. Finally, many lies are in fact embedded in truth. So liars usually give a somewhat true account with sufficient details that are changed so they can avoid detection. As you can see in this case, when we're talking about that type of lying that is covered in the truth, is something very, very similar to what we said about filtering. So filtering in itself is a form of lying. So we are simply covering the truth with sufficient details so that it is favorable for conveying a convenient meaning to the message that we want to convey. And that is something that tends to happen a lot in politics, but also in organizational context as well. And we have something else that tends to also create barriers to effective communication, and that is the rise or the rapid rise of something that we know as politically correct communication. And politically correct communication is something that probably is becoming ever more important because we have multicultural societies nowadays. And as long as we have a lot of cultures, we tend to create, especially at organizational levels, we tend to create communication channels that are impartial when it comes to a certain cultures. Because we know that, for example, certain messages can be misinterpreted, or certain nonverbal cues can, or even verbal or written cue information or messages can be offensive to certain people, even if they are normal to other people, such as our okay sign, for example. We tend to create or to wander off these types of offensive or potentially offensive messages, and we tend to simply create these types of neutral communication methods that are politically correct communication. So politically correct communication is simply a communication that is so concerned with being inoffensive that usually meaning and simplicity are lost, or free expression is in fact hampered, because people tend to wander around the communication channel so that they can not offend anybody, and because certain words in fact do tend to stereotype, intimidate, as well as insult. So in a highly diverse workforce, this is problematic. For example, garbage can be misinterpreted and it tend to become, for example, post-consumer waste material. When we're talking about quotas, because quotas might seem very aggressive and very impersonal, we tend to call them, for example, post-consumer waste materials, as well as women tend to become people of gender. So basically, in some societies, it apparently is offensive to call women women, so we simply call that they are people of gender. And obviously, there have been a lot of insight when it comes to use of even overused or very standard business words when it comes to certain offensive potential. And also we ought to mention that we have also called brainstorming as a very standard, for example, method for that session when we are sharing information. But in certain cultures or even probably in the wider modern business world, brainstorming is deemed to be somewhat offensive because it relates to certain brain illnesses, such as, for example, epilepsy. So, because it is related to the way that said illnesses are transmitted or are in fact expressed, brainstorming tends to be used as a word less and less in these types of situations. So there are alternative words that we tend to use so that we make sure that we are not offending anyone within the organization, but also at a wider societal level. And such non-standard sanitizing of potentially offensive words can reduce the clarity of messages and also might reduce even the emotional outburst or the nonverbal cues when it comes to speaking about a certain issue or a certain concept of the organization or the message that we are trying to convey in organizational context altogether. But again, politically correct communication is, generally speaking, a step forward when it comes to creating equity and impartiality in organization as well as in society. But we have to make sure, as this slide suggests, not to take it too far in general, because being a woman obviously should not be anything offensive altogether. Being a woman should be something that is as natural or as prideful as being a man. Then, after we get over all the effective communication barriers, we tend to continue to how we can use communication in leadership context as well as a coaching base. So when we talk about communication and leadership, we tend to understand, if you could recall the difference between a normal or an average manager, then we had a successful manager and an efficient manager. So basically, we tend to understand from those slides that managers tend to spend around 40% of their time while communicating. And usually, most of influencing tend to happen through communication as well as relationships. Thus, sending and receiving messages effectively is imperative for business success. And when we're planning the message, we should simply answer, what is the goal of the message? So basically, if we are a manager and we're using a communication to either influence or to simply transmit some information, we need to understand what is the goal of the message. Is the goal of the information of the message to motivate people, to influence people on doing something, or simply to transmit some information that might be interesting or important for the subordinates, or the vice versa? If the goal of the message is some sort of feedback loop from the employees or the bottom-up method, we should understand whether we are trying as employees to communicate a problem that is basically technical, that is interpersonal in nature, or what is the goal of the message, what we are trying to transmit by using the communication channels. Also, who should receive the message? So basically, either top-down, bottom-up, or lateral communication, we need to understand that we
ought to create a goal of a message that is indeed specified for somebody in particular. So we need to understand that who should be receiving the message and how will the message be sent. When and where will the message be transmitted? So basically, by now, we need to understand what is the message that we want to send, who will be listening to the message and receiving it, how and when and where will the message be transmitted. So basically, this is the communication channel, this is the recipient, and this is the message context itself. So if we know all of these, we can safely assume that we are doing an effective communication transmission with low probability for ambiguity or misunderstanding. Because if we know what is the message we want to send, to whom we want to send, we know how we can formulate the message. So basically, if we are trying to communicate some sort of important information about the organization, so either the organization is being transferred, so people are being laid off, or the organization is being so successful that it will increase their operations, then obviously we should be using some sort of more direct, so face-to-face types of messages, or we will be doing that during work time or when everybody is present, probably in uh, some sort of meeting room or a bigger area when everybody can join. But again, if the goal of the message is simply to inform people of some routine changes, then we should understand that the people who should be receiving it, for example, will be the engineering team. And because it is routine, we can simply send a memo or an email. And that would be sent, for example, again, during work time so that they can read it. So the when and where is something that can be done with a how as well. So if it is routine, we use the less richer communication methods. If it is non-routine, we go with more richer communication channels altogether. So what is the oral message sending process? Again, we're talking about using the most primary communication method, which is the oral communication, and how, in fact, managers can use the oral message sending process in their own effective method. So basically, the first step in order to create this effective oral message sending process is to tend to develop some sort of rapport between the sender and the receiver. So by familiarizing ourselves with the receiver, usually by doing, for example, some small talk that are linked to the message, we can, in fact, create this rapport and also break the ice so we can continue with communicating what the issue is that you want to discuss. So the second step would be basically to state the communication objective for so by this you do not have to state it verbally. There are of course even non-verbal cues that are related to stating the objective of the communication. Basically, if we want to understand whether we want to influence the receiver of the message, whether we want to simply inform or simply express feelings to that person. Through stating this objective, the receiver should know what to expect from the message. So after you basically have developed a rapport and basically you have created the climate to transmit the message by stating the communication objective, you go ahead and transmit the actual message. So you tell people what is expected of them uh, that is related to motivating. You simply pass instruction that is informing them, or you simply set deadlines if the objective is again to influence people and so forth. So basically, when you transmit the message, you also create some sort of a feedback loop mechanism. But before you do that, or if you want to in fact enforce the feedback loop, you go to the fourth process element of the oral message sending process, that is to check if the receiver has understood the message altogether. How do we do that? By asking questions for the receiver or simply paraphrasing. So you ask, for example, the receiver whether he has understood everything, whether there is something that is unclear. That is usually the process that we tend to finish our lectures, and asking you to either chat the issues or simply email them if you have them further on during review of the course, for example. So basically, another way would be if you ask the receiver to paraphrase or use other forms of feedback. By paraphrasing, so asking them to repeat what they have understood of the message, you tend to be sure that the message has been understood in the manner that the speaker, in fact, or the sender has intended to. There has been no distortion because of some other barriers that we have discussed already. And the final step to the oral message sending process basically would be to get a commitment or some sort of follow-up. So basically, when we're trying, especially in the organizational landscape, when we're trying to transmit some oral message, we basically want to induce or to send towards or to tend to create some sort of action. So by following up, then we tend to think that information and expressing, for example, feeling objectives do not need commitment, whereas influencing, for example, when we're trying to influence, commitment is key, since actions should be taken and tasks should be completed within a commonly agreed, for example, deadline. So basically, a commitment is something that is related to influence, but not to simply sharing information. If we're sharing information, or if we are creating some sort of activity, then obviously we need a commitment as well as a follow-up process. And by completing each of these 5 steps, we tend that we have created an efficient oral message sending process in general. But on the other hand, it is not only important to send a message appropriately, we should also be able to receive a message just as well and efficiently, because in an organizational context, we are not only faced or charged with telling other people what to do, but no matter where we are in the hierarchy of the organization, we will be faced with positions when we receive information, be that at the top level management or even the lower tier employees altogether. So again, the message receiving process is a 3-step process, that is listening, analyzing, and check for understanding. So when we are listening, we ought to pay attention. We should pay attention so that we can understand the message altogether. And when we pay attention, we also need to make sure that we are avoiding any distraction or the noise that we discussed during the message transmission earlier last week. So basically, we avoid a distraction by being staying tuned in the information, and by not assuming anything or not judging anything or not interrupting the other party. So basically, the most important part of listening is to simply listen. So pay attention, try not to distract ourselves, even though, as we said, nowadays, this problem is that we tend to have our smartphones everywhere. So basically, even if we are in a business meeting, even if we are in a face-to-face communication method, there is a nudge or a vibration that tends to takes us to distract us from the direct communication. So it is very important that as listeners, when we are in a listening position or message receiving process, we ought to pay attention to avoid distraction and to stay tuned in into the message itself. We should not assume or interrupt altogether. So basically, we should, instead of assuming what the sender is in fact thinking when they're transmitting the message, it's easier for us to simply check for nonverbal cues, because those nonverbal cues, as we said, are usually more important, and they tend to convey a truer meaning rather than what the message in itself is. So basically, the way that the importance is given to certain information chunks can help us to check what would be in fact the hidden message behind the real message, if there is any. Also, we should ask questions later, but not interrupting the person, taking notes if it is a more formalized meeting, obviously, as well as to try to convey what would be the meaning of this entire message process altogether. So after finishing the listening period, so basically after the message has been conveyed and we have listened it entirely, what we should do is give it some time for us to analyze the message. So basically we tend to analyze, and analyzing the message simply means that we ought to use our brain capacity. So basically we need to think, and also we need to wait so we can evaluate the message until after listening everything. So basically it is much more easier to understand a message if we are patient enough to listen and think after the message has been transmitted to check whether everything has been understood or everything is within the confinements of the expected message delivery process. After the analyzing, the best thing to do is probably to check whether we have understood what the message intended us to speak. So basically, when we're trying to check for understanding, we usually tend to do so by paraphrasing. Again, so paraphrasing means to repeat or to summarize in front of the message sender what has been said so that we can show or check or cross-evaluate whether we have understood the message the way that the sender wanted to transmit the message, as well as also, again, watch for non-verbal cues, especially when paraphrasing or when asking questions. This is very important. So again, watching for non-verbal cues is very important because non-verbal communication is just as, probably even more important than what is being said formally. So what is paraphrasing? Again, we will not stop that long in this because we have already discussed it many times by now. So paraphrasing is simply the process of having the receiver restate the message in his or her own words to ensure that communication has taken place. So basically is when we as receivers tend to restate the message in our own words. So basically to summarize what we have heard so that we can make sure that communication has taken place. And by communication, we mean effective transmission of message. Communication from creating the idea, to encoding the message, to transmitting the message through the noise, to decoding the message and understanding it by the receiver. So basically, so that the communication has taken place, we use paraphrasing as a feedback loop to find out whether the message has been understood in general. So again, we have mentioned feedback many times over, and probably in nowadays in the 21st century, few people don't understand what feedback is, even if they don't formally use feedback in their day-to-day use or even organizational use. We might have seen the terminology feedback in many of our electronic endeavors that we have made. For example, when we have used some website, when we have used some other electronic resources, by the end or somewhere in the middle, some pop-up has come up and we were asked to provide feedback on our experience while using some online or digital resource. So basically, the company that has made some product or some online resources tend to understand whether we are in fact we are receiving the same benefits or the same attributes by the product, or as would be the case in our communication process of the message that was intended by the company. So again, in the organizational behavior context, especially in the communication context, feedback is the process of verifying messages as well as determining if objectives of the message have been met. So what are the roles of feedback? The roles of feedback would simply be to verify the messages. So simply we are trying to verify the message by questioning them, by paraphrasing and commenting, as well as suggestions. Something that probably you have witnessed that we have highly encouraged during our lecturing and course experience altogether, especially commenting, suggesting, as well as questioning. But why not even paraphrasing? Paraphrasing is probably done when we have some more, let's say, essay type questions that we will be having later on in our final exam sessions. So the first role of feedback would be to verify the message. And verifying the message is important because we then understand that the message has been efficiently delivered, so that we can use that to understand that there is no difference or discrepancy between the intended message and the accepted message. And the other one would be to meet objectives. So basically another role of feedback, and that is how probably it is used in most organizational context, is when we use feedback also to check the meeting of objectives. So we tend to set specific, measurable objectives and monitor their progress. So basically the feedback is used as a monitoring mechanism to check whether the objectives has been met. And again, in this case, objectives can very easily be communicated. So basically the way that we have communicated objectives as higher management or as an organization toward lower tier employees is very important. So basically, if we have been efficient enough to communicate and motivate people and share with them sufficient critical information for them to make do and understand the objectives so they can solve them in due time, then we can use also the meeting or the feedback as a mechanism to check whether the objectives have been in fact met and whether everybody is happy in that case. So being open to feedback is also known as criticism. So, or let's put it this way, feedback sometimes is highly related to criticism. So because we tend to understand that not all feedback is always positive, by using feedback, we know what we did wrong, where we could improve, in fact, and that is the role of criticism. So feedback sometimes is criticism, and people that are open to criticism, in fact, tend to improve themselves and to adjust more to the objectives of the organization itself. What are the common approaches when we try to get feedback? So basically, there are, for example, these types of situations. When we give the entire message, such as this lecture, for example, and we usually tend to end it by, do you have any questions? And that has been traditional for our lectures. You might agree, for example. So basically, we give the entire lecture up to the end. We tend then to ask, do you have any questions? Even though we tend usually to ask or to propose that we ask questions even during the lecture. But again, the most formal way that we are doing this is by transmitting the entire lecture and then asking, do you have any questions? Another approach to getting feedback, or is it an approach, is by sending the entire message and simply assuming that it has been conveyed with mutual understanding. To common knowledge, obviously, by assuming or by judging, we are not leaving room for the criticism factor. So basically, because we are assuming, we are cutting short on the feedback loop. So if we ask for suggestions, do you have any questions? Or we should also add, and we'll try to add that from now on, do you have any questions or comments? Then obviously we are opening up to other suggestions as well. So basically not only questions related to misunderstanding, but also comments to how we can do better. And that is the concept of modern organizations altogether. But on the other hand, if we send the entire message and we simply say thank you and goodbye without asking for questions or opening the door for the feedback loop, we are assuming and we are closing up to criticism, and that is not obviously a way to getting feedback. Obviously, we're talking about common approaches, but not necessarily the common positive or accurate approaches to get feedback. There is a positive one, obviously, denoted by the upward arrow, and there is a negative one on the left, denoted by a downwards arrow. So approaches to getting feedback and why they don't work. So there are obviously other reasons why people don't ask a question, or basically they lean towards this part of the non-correct feedback loop. So there are a reason why people don't ask a question altogether. And one would be, for example, if receivers of the message simply feel ignorant. And by that, we mean that if they ask questions, they might be considered as a sign of not paying attention or not being smart enough to understand the issue. And this is very wrong, obviously, but again, it is something that is related to certain cultures, for example. So they feel ignorant if they ask a question. So if somebody asks a question, for example, they feel that we might assume that they have not paid attention enough, or we might assume that they are not smart enough to understand the issues in the first try, which is obviously, again, we're talking about why they don't ask questions and why this is getting feedback can become difficult. Obviously, feedback is a positive aspect of communication process. So now we're looking at the problems that we face while getting feedback. And this is one of the issues. And we're talking about issue because people should not feel ignorant about receiving a message. As we said, even the most simple message, again, might convey different meaning based on the receiver or what is intended by the message by the receiver in this case. So basically, you receiver should never feel ignorant about asking question. Another reason why people don't ask questions might be because they are in fact ignorant. So by that we mean that they do not know enough to know if what we are conveying as a message, what the sender is in fact talking about, is incomplete, incorrect, or whether it is subject to interpretation. Because they do not know enough regarding the topic, they assume that everything that has been said is correct, because they don't have enough knowledge to question, if possible, the authenticity of the message itself. Another issue is that receivers are reluctant to point out the sender's ignorance. Again, there is something very wrong with this. And it usually happens when we're talking about hierarchical organizations, because employees fear that questioning the message of managers is a wrong thing to do, since it can be understood as if they are questioning the managers themselves, and that is something they do not want to do, because that might increase or anger them and put them in a worse off position when it comes to their consideration for other activities. So basically, they do not want to get on the bad side of their bosses, even though they might, for example, know more than their managers. And that is usually the case in business organizations when there is a meeting, for example, and a meeting that tends to speak about technical issues, for example, in project management environments. And obviously, we might understand that a technical team, an engineering team, might know a lot more, for example, than a project manager or a senior management about the technical aspects of the project. So basically, even though the technical team tend to know more, they are reluctant to point out that the sender, in this case the PM or the higher management, are ignorant when it comes to that, or relatively more ignorant than them when it comes to that topic. So they simply stay quiet. Another issue might be that the receivers have cultural barriers. So basically what we're talking here is that in high context cultures that we have discussed, such as the case, for example, for some Asian countries, Japanese culture, for example, it is very impolite or even offensive to question or disagree with managers. So the answer, do you understand, no matter whether it has been understood or not, is usually answered with yes. So basically, you do not hear no very often in Chinese or Japanese cultures, because that is a strict cultural dogma with disagreeing or saying no. Very interesting. So where does coaching fit in all this? So basically, we are using now communication, and we can use communication in organizational landscape to coach people. What is coaching? Coaching is the process of giving motivational feedback to maintain and improve performance. So basically, is to use communication methods to influence people and motivate them to do better, or simply to change something if employees or the organization has done wrong. It is simply designed to maximize employee strengths and to minimize weaknesses. So coaching is probably another phase of feedback when it comes to criticism. Instead of criticizing people, we tend to coach them. And usually we have this 10-step process, and obviously the last one would be don't criticize. So it is, again, as we said, an alternative to criticizing people. The first guideline or the first point would be to develop a supportive working relationship. So when we're talking about to develop a supportive working relationship is when the relationship between employee and manager comes at utmost importance to employee success. So a supportive working relationship builds commitment and urges to improve oneself. So basically, an organization tends to create a sense of community as well as a sense of a team or teamwork when it comes to dealing with day-to-day issues or even successes. So there has to be some sort of a positive and supportive relationship between the manager and the employees. The second would be to give praise as well as recognition, when obviously praise and recognition is due. So that would motivate people to maintain as well as increase performance altogether. Then by giving prize and recognition when prize and recognition is due, that does not mean that we should in fact blame somebody who has done something wrong. So basically we are stating that we should praise if somebody has done something right, but we should strictly avoid blame and embarrassment, especially embarrassment of people in front of other colleagues. A leader seeks to develop employees' knowledge, abilities, and skills. So if an employee realizes that they have made a mistake, there is no need to verbalize because that will simply make them feel bad. Mistakes should be considered by a proper leader as learning experience. So basically, we need to convey that this mistake has happened for a certain reason, and we should allow for a margin for the employees to simply learn from mistakes. And obviously, only if the mistake has been repeated multiple times should we see what would be the issue to this behavioral pattern at the employee. So obviously, again, even if, as we said, the mistake has been repeated many times, we should not focus on the person, on the employee. We should focus on the behavioral pattern. So in any situation that focusing on a person tend to place blame and embarrassment. So one should focus on the behavior. So if an employee talks too much on the meeting, for example, a leader shouldn't say you talk too much, but rather let's see what others have to say. So basically, in that case, we are focusing on the behavior. The behavior is that not everybody is participating, and not on putting a blame or embarrassing somebody that they tend to talk a lot, because we understand that there are people that are more outgoing than the others. And another coaching guidelines would be for the leader would be that a leader should have employees assess their own performance, and that is something very interesting. So basically, we are asking not only for us to give them some sort of performance evaluation, but we're asking them to give their own performance evaluation. When we pass, for example, the ball to employees, we tend to not accuse them, which would in fact, so basically we would accuse them if we criticize or have performance evaluation given to them by us, but because that will trigger some sort of defensive behavior, obviously. But rather, we tend to see the problem from the solution standpoint, not the blaming one. So if there is some issue, we are asking the employee to evaluate themselves, and by doing so, we are looking at how their perspective of the issue would be. So basically, they might see that if we see that they are non-performant, they might, again, by evaluating themselves, they might say that I'm not performing well because there is a lack of resources, for example, or there is lack of communication or some other sort of issues that, again, would be from the solution standpoint. This will help the leader to better be prepared to solve the issue that the employee is facing. Another guideline would be to give specific and descriptive feedback. So basically now we're talking again about giving feedback, but we ought to be very specific because a specific feedback, in fact, tend to avoid confusion for behavior that needs to improve. Whereas when we are being descriptive, then we tend to base or to tell a person that our communication is based on observed as well as proven fact or some inferred ones. Then always we ought to seek to give factual or descriptive feedback, since inferred feedback cannot be well proven and may be considered as judgmental, and they are often judgmental altogether. So basically, whenever we give feedback, we should have sufficient proof or observation, that first-hand observation, when it comes to giving these types of feedback. Also, we should give coaching feedback as well. When a negative behavior is observed, we ought to respond positively, because responding positively can be managed by selling the benefits of an alternative or a positive alternative behavior. For example, if an employee handles a heavy box incorrectly, instead of telling them, you pick the box wrong, don't let it happen again, or don't let me see you do that again, which is probably a negative outcome to a negative, or a negative critique to a negative action, we might, a leader, for example, or a coach might explain that in order not to hurt your back, use your legs when lifting heavy boxes. So basically now we are trying to tell them why the way that a person is doing is negative and what are the benefits of doing it the correct way. So we can choose whether to be a coach or to be an autocrat. So simply telling people why is wrong. So being a coach means that we are trying to be descriptive in our feedback in this case. We should provide modeling and training. What we mean by that is that a good manager tends to obviously lead by example, since employees seek to copy the manager. So basically, if we tend to visualize, and most of the pictures that we can find on Google Image, for example, of a leader versus the manager, we tend to think that a leader is the one who leads. So basically tends to lead by example, and employees tend to follow the leader. And usually this modeling and training can be done by, for example, some sort of job instructional training that happens everywhere, in just-in-time training, such as, for example, when a trainee receives preparation for what they will be doing, the trainer would present the task, the trainee would perform the task, and the trainer would follow up to check whether they have understood or whether the task has been done up to the standard that the trainer wants. So basically, this makes all the process to become a rolling knowledge basis rather than a formal training process. So basically, we have to include coaching in the training process altogether. Also, we should make feedback timely but flexible. So by this, we mean that feedback should be given as soon as the behavior has been observed. That means that if we let a behavior or certain action to happen and then cool down before telling, usually it tends to have less impact or effect. But also, we should be flexible in giving feedback, because it becomes important when we don't have time to do a full coaching in the workplace and when emotions are high. So if we have a lot of emotions, basically, even though we said in the first place that we should give the feedback as soon as the behavior has been observed, if we see that there is a high tension or high emotions involved, it's probably better to wait up. But on the other hand, if there are not a lot of emotions or we have sufficient time, we should probably give the feedback as soon as the action has happened. And finally, as we said, we shouldn't criticize. Criticizing is bad. Again, we're talking about the concept of destructive criticism, though there are some researchers that state that there are no such thing as constructive criticism, because all criticism is destructive. Correcting someone should be done if the mistake is repeated more than once and only by challenging them to make a more positive contribution. So as we said earlier, we should focus on the behavior and not on the person. So by doing that, we tend to not criticize the person or the way that the person is doing things, but we're trying to focus on the idea that the behavior is probably a combination of both internal as well as external factors. And by that, we tend to make the problem not personal. And by doing so, we avoid blame and embarrassment, and we become better leaders by using these coaching techniques altogether. So what is the difference between coaching feedback as well as criticism? Basically, coaching feedback is based on a good supportive relationship between the leader as well as the employee, and on the follower doing a self-assessment of performance. It is very specific, descriptive, and makes people feel like they are winners. Whereas the criticism in itself is a judgmental and makes people feel like losers. So that's why we should focus on coaching feedback, because usually if we use criticism too much, we tend to raise the defensive behavior or some defensive barrier between communication between the levels of the hierarchy within the company. So basically, by coaching them, we are telling them that the problem is at the behavior, not at the people altogether. So there are some coaching models for people that are substandard performers. So basically, there is something that we tend to call an attribution theory, and this attribution theory basically is used to explain the process that managers go through to determine what are the reasons for effective or ineffective performance, and what can be done in regard to it. So basically, there are two stages to this attribution theory. The first one would be that we should determine what is the cause of the poor performance. Basically, we use the performance formula, and the performance formula would mean that it is a function of ability, motivation, or resources. So by this, we attribute that any a substandard performance of the employee is basically something that has to do with ability of the person. So basically, a person is not able to perform the assigned task. That's why they are performing at a substandard level. That does not mean that they are not smart enough. That might also mean that they have not been trained properly enough. Then they might lack motivation. And we understand, because we have made an entire lecture on motivation and how it affects human behavior, generally speaking. So motivation might be the action or the problem, or the resources can be the problem. So there are cases when people are highly knowledgeable, they are highly motivated, but they simply miss the resources. And the resources might be financial, as we state usually during the project management course. They might be financial, or they might be technical, or even time-wise when it comes to dealing with something. So we should take appropriate corrective action. If we attribute that the problem to substandard performance is the ability, so the ability is low, what we should do is basically we should train them so they can raise the ability to how they do things. And we do that with just-in-time training, one of the modern forms when we can train people on the spot and using modern technologies to train them correctly. But on the other hand, if we have a motivation issue with the employees altogether, then what we should do obviously is to go back to the coaching process and to go to number 2. So basically to give them praise and recognition. So what we should do, give praise and use motivational techniques to improve the course of action so they feel motivated or part of the organization or useful for the organization. On the other hand, obviously, if the resources are low, then what should we do? As simple as securing the proper resources so that we can continue working. So basically, we should adjust the activity based on the attribution theory on why there is a certain substandard performance. So this entire process of improving performance with a coaching model, or this performance formula, basically is of how we can use this performance formula. How can we find whether it is ability, motivation, of resources? Basically is by describing what the current performance is. So we know that it is substandard, but we need to detail what is going on that is not working correct. And after we tell what is the current performance, we continue to describe what or where do we want to see ourselves. So basically, by contrasting where we currently are to where we currently want to be, we tend to understand what is the gap. So basically, there should be a gap that exists between where we currently are and where we want to be. And usually this type of analysis is called also a gap analysis. So basically, by using this gap analysis, we tend to understand what should be done. After we know what should be done, we go for action. So by action, we mean that we tend to understand that we ought to get a commitment to the change. So basically, we know what is wrong. By doing the gap analysis, we created a list of actionable activities, and then we get a commitment to the change from where we currently are to where we want to be. And after we've done that, we do a follow-up activity. So basically, we check whether the actions have improved so that we can give praise, or there is still something else. So basically, if there is still something else that is creating this unfavorable current performance, then we should continue this loop altogether. So as you can see, follow-up is never the end of the communication or the coaching process. It basically tends to create a new beginning, so a loop. So a follow-up is usually a loop that tends to resolve ongoing issues, or if the current performance is great, then this would be the end of a certain activity. So by now we have completed the communication as well as the coaching segments of the lecture, and we have effectively also reached the end of this course. So by next week we will follow with negotiation and techniques. So do you have any questions regarding communication and coaching, or any other questions or comments as well? As we said, if not, then thank you very much for being a part of this lecture, and we'll see each other next week. Goodbye.